Hello everybody and welcome to OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today we're going to be taking a look at the full Wild Force and Cyber Judge sets that were revealed this morning over in Japan. These sets come out next Friday over there, and then we receive them on March the 22nd, and this will be the set that's new and ready for EYC, along with the E-Block rotation as well, so pretty exciting stuff. We've already talked about some of these cards in a previous video with Joe, but wanted to go through, or I'm going to go through basically everything we haven't already talked about, so if you haven't checked out that video, make sure you do, so you can see some of the cards that I will briefly sort of speak about, but not go into too much detail with. Whilst we're scrolling down to the trainers as well, make sure you check out the Potown store where you can get 5% off your order using code OmniPoke. Great for picking up live codes, both right now, but also when the set is released, ready for practicing for EOIC and rotation and stuff as well. So, kicking things off with the trainers, already talked about order box a little bit, seems a little bit too slow in decks overall. Ending your turn is kind of awkward when we're in a meta where we have plenty of ways of being able to shuffle the hand in, or Iono's seeing quite a lot of play and stuff. Not necessarily the strongest of cards overall. Awakening Drum is the first Ace Spec we're going to talk about. Obviously, Ace Specs are returning with this set. You're allowed one in your deck, generally item or tool cards, or in this case, Special Energy as well. This draws a card for each of your ancient Pokemon in play. Again, one we've already discussed. Seems that it could be quite good in the sort of one prize Roaring Moon archetype. Still don't think there's much of a reason to play it over Prime Catcher in like the Raging Bolt style decks, the more aggressive style decks. But I think this could be a really good in the one prize Roaring Moon deck, I should say. So yeah, quite an interesting one there. Again, we've already discussed a lot of these cards, but I want to at least address some of them. Obviously, Buddy Poffin, fantastic item card that's going to sort of replace Battle of VIP Pass in some decks. Really good for searching out things like Ralts, things like Charmander, things like Comfey, are going to be very important, but not quite as flexible as VIP Pass when it comes to searching out EXs, when it comes to searching out things with more than 70 HP, so Radiant Greninja, even some evolving basics that we'll chat about later that don't have 70 HP, they have 80 or 90 HP. A little bit more awkward, so a bit more fine-tuned, but still really good for those evolution-based decks. I think it's going to be a pretty key piece of the format going forward as to potentially why to play, potentially why to play some of these evolution decks, things like Chi and Power Excalibur also really likes this card as well. So yeah, really, really powerful card. Emergency Board, again, one we've already discussed. Really good for Comfey style engines, being able to get an additional retreat, additional flower selecting is going to be really powerful. I think most of the time this secondary text is not quite as relevant as it has been in the past, but even just having a retreating tool that Comfey can make use of is going to be really powerful. Also have reprints of Ancient Booster Capsule and also Future Booster Capsule when we get there as well. The first truly new card we're going to talk about today is another Ace Spec Maximum Belt. The attacks used by this Pokemon in this card attach you to 50 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon EX. Yeah, really, really interesting card, to be honest. Very powerful tool. I was wondering when we were going to see some kind of damage specifically for EXs, and it turns out it's in the form of an Ace Spec right now rather than like a Choice Belt or Choice Band style card. Some key breakpoints for this one. Could be really powerful in Charizard quite early. Obviously, you can Arven it out, as well as having access to Pidgeot to be able to shoot this out at the right time. So, yeah, it could be really powerful in Charizard to try and initiate prize races, where initially before you may have had to wait for your opponent to start taking a prize card, or to have taken some prize cards for you to be able to trade into EXs here and there. Could also be quite relevant for Giratina against Charizard, because it turns your Lost Impact from 280 to 330, which is obviously the perfect number, meaning that you still have Star Requiem later on in the game as well, which at the moment can sometimes prove to be a bit of a sticking point for Giratina. Obviously, only having one way of being able to one-shot a Charizard is quite annoying, so this could potentially see play in that archetype as well. I'm sure there will be plenty of other uses for this as well, but I think those two are the ones that stand out the most for me. Explorer's Guidance, we've already discussed. A Hapu reprint, really good for, again, that Roaring Moon archetype, but just in general, potentially overtaking Colress in some other decks that like to see additional draw supporters or like turbo draw supporters in combination with Professor's Research. Yeah, I think this could be a pretty good replacement for that, to be honest. I also think there could potentially be argument for it to see play over Research in some specific situations, but I think most of the time Research is going to be still your go-to draw supporter that fills this kind of role. Eerie, again, another one we've talked about, really good for controlling archetypes. I think this is going to help keep Snorlax on the map. The next new card is Morty's Conviction, and another supporter card. You can only use this card if you discard another card from your hand, then you draw a card for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Quite a strong effect, potentially. Like, if it's a draw 3, it's arguably worse than a hop, but if it's like a draw 4, it's a similar amount of cards to like a hop or a how or that style of card. With additional discard synergy. Now, that could be seen as a negative, but really you're going to be playing this in a deck where you're going to be seeing that as a positive, maybe like a Gardevoir archetype or something like that, where you want to be discarding Psychic Energy as well as being able to draw cards to find more Curlius, find more Gardevoirs, that kind of thing. So yeah, could see play in addition to or alongside things like Research and stuff in specific archetypes. Again, because this is tutorable with things like Luminion, you're able to fish this out at the right time. A little bit more limiting against some of the decks that don't quite go as wide, but we do still have quite a lot of decks that like to fill the board. All of these evolving Stage 2 decks still like to fill the board with lots of basics early on. You've still got things like the Turbo decks, the Roaring Moons, the Raging Bolts, the Miraidon decks that are going to go quite wide quite quickly to be able to start pressuring you with a lot of attackers. So I can see this fitting in certain situations. I still think there's other potential options here and there for draw supporters that you may choose to play over Morty's Conviction if maybe the discard synergy isn't relevant for your deck. But I think decks that are vying for another piece of draw support, or another draw supporter and another piece of discard synergy could potentially weave this in as a one of, maybe even a two of in certain circumstances as well. We've then got a Stadium Dangerous Jungle. During Pokemon Checkup, you put 2 more damage counters on each poison Pokemon. So hark back to Verbank City. Obviously a very, very impactful stadium back from the Black and White era. Don't think this one's quite as powerful just because we don't have access as easy to poison. Well, we don't have we have splashable poison access in the form of Brute Bonnet, but that's not Hypnotoxic Laser. Hypnotoxic Laser was really, really accessible. It also had the upside of potentially sleeping your opponent and stalling them, like a 25% chance to stop them from even attacking potentially next turn as well. This doesn't affect Dark-type Pokemon, which is interesting. I can't think of any Dark-type synergies in particular that this would benefit. But again, Dark types obviously representing the Poison type now, they typically have the attacks that benefit Poison. You know, you've got things like Hisuian Radiant Sneasler and stuff like that, or Radiant Hisuian Sneasler. So this in combination with Sneasler is actually a 5, it's then 5 counters for Poison, which is pretty powerful. That's a lot of damage, to be honest. It's just obviously quite a big package to be playing. The Dangerous Jungle, using your Radiant for your deck, and then having to find ways of getting your opponent's Pokemon poisoned. Realistically, Brute Bonnet is probably one of the more reliable ways. So, yeah, it's quite a in-depth or quite a costly package to add into your deck. There may still be decks that try and do this, though, and this could be like a way of bumping up the numbers, but I don't think this is going to be quite as impactful as Verbank has been in the past. And finally, for this set, there's Neo Upper Energy as well. Again, not one we've really discussed on the channel, but hasn't really been anything that we've seen so far that I think really, really benefits from this. Potentially like a Meowscarada or something, but a lot of the time Reversal is doing its job quite similarly. Obviously, you have to be behind on prizes for Reversal, but I still think that's kind of fine. And there are some very powerful Ace Specs out there that I think probably have a little bit more impact than this. So I think a lack of efficient partners, as well as having some other very powerful Ace Specs, means that we're kind of struggling to find a home for Neo Upper Energy overall. We'll quickly scroll to the other trainers from the Cyber Judge set, just so we can have a full-on overview of what we have access to. Hand Clippers, again, already one we've talked about, pretty powerful for that controlling, for the controlling archetypes, for things like Block Snorlax to stop your opponent trying to build a big hand and then just Iono and buy themselves more turns. Definitely going to be a key piece in that archetype, I think. Prime Catcher, I still think, is the most powerful Ace Spec. Nothing has really changed there. I think there's actually been some Ace Specs that you have to consider, though, which is really good, because I think when we first saw Prime Catcher, a lot of people were like, why are we ever going to consider any other Ace Spec? I think in certain situations, there will be Ace Specs that you want to consider over Prime Catcher, but as a hard and fast rule, if there isn't a particular Ace Spec that works well in your deck, Prime Catcher is just going to be in pretty much everything outside of like niche archetypes or specific archetypes. So yeah, very, very powerful card. I'm still surprised that they printed this card, to be quite honest. And yeah, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of Prime Catcher going around, along with things like Arven and Irida tutoring it out, stuff like that. Reboot Pod, one we discussed on the last video, still really good for those future decks. They didn't really gain too many other resources that we hadn't already seen, but there's nothing that really surprised me or worries me about this archetype either, so I still think this is going to be a really key piece in that future deck. Hero's Cape, again, not one I think is going to be too impactful, going to be seen in potentially niche cases, things like the Wigglytuff EX that can get really big, or Reverum EX that can have multiple tools attached to it. You may end up choosing to play Hero's Cape just to really buff those kinds of cards. But I think overall, there's not as many uses for this as potentially some people first thought. Maybe we could see this in some other archetypes here and there to try and stay out of range, or just present like a really big one prize difficult option to knock out along with like an Iono or something. But again, it feels like this is the kind of Ace Spec that Prime Catcher a lot of the time will just be overtaking regardless of what deck you're playing. Again, as I mentioned, a reprint to Future Booster Energy Capsule, not one that keeps it in format any longer. You can see on the regulation it's still G block, whereas these are now we're going into H block, so that won't stay. This and the Ancient Booster Capsule won't stay in format any longer than they originally would have, but just obviously easily accessible. We've then got Heavy Baton, a new Pokemon tool that says if the Pokemon with a retreat cost of exactly 4 this card is attached to is your active Pokemon and is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, move up to 3 basic energy cards from that Pokemon to your bench Pokemon in any way you like. So similar to that Wishful Baton of the past, but specific for 4 retreat cost Pokemon. Not masses and masses of uses here. I think people have already kind of discussed Iron Hands, being able to Iron Hands into Iron Hands with a baton is quite interesting. I think we have pretty reliable ways of setting up Iron Hands anyway, but we do lose things like Flaffy and Raihan going forward, so this could be a potential one-of in Miraidon decks to try and really capitalize on just reserving those energy that you've placed onto Iron Hands to try and take early tempo knockouts and try and take some early prizes. They could even go they can even go to like another Miraidon or something, or a Raichu, so they don't necessarily have to go into another Iron Hands. Could just be a good way of trying to keep those energy on the board. Could also be like a Ting-Lu style, potentially like a buff to Ting-Lu. I'm pretty sure Ting-Lu has 4 retreats, so that could be another potential option. But I think the Iron Hands option is the biggest one out there, and I think that this could see play as like a one-of in those Miraidon decks that maybe try and play Arven as well to search out basics early on. Cryptomaniac's Deciphering, again, one we've kind of discussed already. This is just a reprint of Mallow, but I think it's a pretty impactful one. We've still got Refinement Curlier, we've still got Goldengo, we've still got Radiant Greninja. All of these decks are able to then tutor the exact 2 cards they need and draw into them to help the flow of the game, which could be pretty powerful as a one-of in certain situations. Yeah, I think this could be quite an impactful card for some specific archetypes. Salvatore is a new supporter card that is very reminiscent of Wally from the old Evolving Skies set. You search your deck for a Pokemon except any Pokemon with abilities that evolves from one of your Pokemon in play, and put that on that Pokemon to evolve it. Then shuffle your deck. But the key is you're able to do it on the first turn or the turn this Pokemon was put into play. So turn 1, you can search for an evolution Pokemon that does not have an ability and evolve it straight away. Pretty powerful effect. I don't think there's masses of options out there right now. I think one of the best options is actually going to be potentially Bayonet. Obviously, Bayonet being able to then start item locking from turn 1 if you're going second. It's a little bit scary. I'm not overly worried. I think there's still some limitations to that archetype. It being Dark Week is a pretty key one. Charizard decks just need to like start playing an extra Charmeleon or 2, and all of a sudden they're going to be able to pretty much tear through the deck quite quickly. So there's not too many other options out there right now. We'll have to wait and see whether there are any other big partners that maybe this card opens up archetype wise, but I think the fact that we have such good supporters right now in things like Research and Iono, a lot of the time you're still going to want to be playing something like that. I think people have kind of resigned themselves to the fact that in these metas where evolutions are quite a key factor, there may be situations where you do just have to take an extra turn or two to try and get into the game. So I don't think there's necessarily a pressing need for a card like this right now. But yeah, one of the highly discussed combos on from at least from what I've seen on social media has been that combination with Bennett, which, like I say, I don't think is actually all that strong. I think there's still some potential weaknesses to it, but maybe that will be enough to revive some kind of item locking archetype. Bianca Sincerity, again, one we've already discussed, healing all the damage from one of your Pokemon with 30 HP or less. I don't really think there's anything that this set has shown me that indicates we're going to be in a situation where we are going to be on 30 HP or less quite like consistently enough to warrant this being one of your 60 cards. But again, worth keeping in mind for specific archetypes that may often hit like key break points that mean that you end up with 30 HP or less. Full Metal Lab is a stadium card that says your metal Pokemon take 30, or both players' metal Pokemon take 30 less damage from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon. Pretty powerful for some of these tanky style, particularly EX metal Pokemon. I'm thinking Reveroom for like a tanky style build. I think it does 170 minus 30 with its attack. So that plus some like Defiance belts and stuff, plus this Full Metal Lab could make it quite difficult to actually break through. It could be like a new Goodra style card where you're just representing so much damage reduction. It's pretty much impossible to deal enough damage to knock you out without going through something like a one-shotting effect, like a Roaring Moon style frenzied gouging or something. So yeah, that could be interesting. I don't think we've quite got enough support there still, but maybe we do have enough to be able to try and build like a full Reveroom deck where you're able to attack with EX and you've got the draw engine of the baby Reveroom. And yeah, again, we've got things like Defiance Belt and stuff that can make you quite tanky. Could be an interesting archetype to try building around that's an alternative walling archetype compared to like the Wigglytuff EX or something. Yeah, but whilst we still have plenty of one-shot potential in the format, those kinds of archetypes I do think look a little bit skeptical. And finally, Mist Energy, again, one that helps you, prevent you being knocked out by these kinds of effects. You prevent all effects of attacks done to the Pokemon this card is attached to. So maybe a combination of Mist Energy is needed in that kind of archetype to be able to then prevent yourself or prevent your Reveroom being knocked out by Frenzied Gouging or Star Requiem, and you actually then do become a really tanky archetype that you sort of your opponent struggles to deal with. I think this could be pretty impactful for the likes of Roaring Moon and Tina going forward. They may have to start playing things like Temple of Sinnoh to get around this, or maybe some kind of way of discarding energy or specific special energy. I think Temple is probably the least invasive of those options, though. So yeah, we'll have to see. These kinds of effects are always sort of in and out of decks based on the meta and what kind of attackers we have in the format. So yeah, could be a pretty powerful card, one to keep an eye on, and I think it will be pretty impactful for those sort of Roaring Moon and Lost Tina style archetypes. Alrighty, so that's the trainers. They kind of set the scene. We're already 20 minutes in, so we're going to try and turbo through some of these Pokemon. Roselia and Roserade both have Poison Point, but not really anything too relevant overall. Excuse me. Turtwig is the first interesting card, has that 80 HP, which is a little bit unfortunate for Poffin. I think we're going to have to still play plenty of plenty of Ball Search cards trying to find Turtwig, but it does have the solid shell, which is very, very important. Taking 20 less damage means that you do have effectively 100 HP, which is really key for Radiant Greninja. Radiant Greninja obviously typically tries to really try and farm these evolving basics, but you stay out of Radiant Greninja range, which is really important because you potentially don't need Manaphy on your board then, which is, again, really important because as we see with the Torterra, you are looking for, or you're dealing more damage based on each grass Pokemon you have in play. So you don't want to have to limit your damage because you have to put a Manaphy in play. So really, really nice breakpoint here for the Turtwig. Again, quite unfortunate that you don't get to be able to search it out with the Poffin, but the benefits of Solid Shell, I think, are really, really powerful. Grottle is no better than the one that we already have, but worth keeping in mind, we do have the Sunshine Grace Grottle. I can't remember whether that's its ability. It might be Sun-Drenched Shell, actually, I believe is the ability name, which lets you search for grass Pokemon. So basically ignore this Grottle. We have ways of finding Turtwigs and Torterra EXs. Torterra is a 340 HP EX, which is huge, to be honest. It's a grass type, which is very relevant because you're hitting Charizard for weakness, which feels bizarre to say. Torterra having weakness against Charizard doesn't quite make sense in my head, but in this case, it's how the TCG is playing things out. Forest March dealing 30 damage, times the number of grass Pokemon you have in play, so obviously a pretty reliable two-shot if you have a full board, and a one-shot on Charizard if you have a full board, which is very, very powerful. Again, with a lot of the grass options, we have the Grottle for obviously keeping your board stocked and your attackers going, but we also have things like the Whimsicott that we'll talk about momentarily that can fully heal one of your Pokemon. We have Kricketune, potentially, which is quite powerful. We have a lot of grass options right now, a lot of like tech grass Pokemon that could easily pop into the deck to try and fill your board out and also buff up your HP and stuff whilst also dealing additional damage with Forest March. The fact it's 1 energy as well means that you're able to use that Whimsicott that we'll talk about momentarily to fully heal this as well, which is quite cool. So yeah, we then have Jungle Hammer as well for 3 for 150 and you heal 50. I don't think as relevant, but if you're able to get through energy on this, obviously you can then aid yourself in being tanky by healing a bit of damage each turn as well, which is quite powerful. So yeah, I think this is potentially a really interesting archetype. I'm not sure whether there's enough there overall. There's still some questions I have about this archetype, but I think there might be enough for this to be like quite a low to the ground, consistent stage 2 deck that you don't necessarily have to play rare candies in, because you're able to just sort of build off the fact that you're maybe losing a couple of prizes early, but Torterra is so powerful and so tanky, is able to make up for it in the mid game, and then late game, your opponent's just struggling to try and take out a couple of Torterras because they have so much HP. So yeah, I think I'm interested to see how this archetype turns out. It's a little bit better than I initially thought. I thought this was a bit of a meme to begin with, but actually when considering all the grass options we have right now, and grass being a very powerful typing, could be an interesting archetype to play around with. Shaymin has Pinpoint Dive, which does a 60 snipe to an EX or V Pokemon. I don't think this is too relevant, especially while we have like Manaphy in format and stuff like that, but potentially worth popping into that grass deck as a one-of to try and clean things up here and there. Here is that Whimsicott we kind of talked about in the last video, Lifting Heal. Basically working as a max potion for your active grass Pokemon. Quite a powerful effect, but overall, I think in general, not going to see too much play outside of like Torterra EX and maybe like Meowscarada. I think this actually looks a little bit better than Meowscarada, to be honest, the Whimsicott Torterra package. So I think we finally found the partner for Whimsicott. Otherwise, I don't think it would have really seen play outside of... well, I don't think it really would have seen play at all, to be honest, outside of maybe some meme contention here and there. Heatmore and the Senscorch line are pretty uninspiring, to be honest. Gouging Fire still looks to be quite a powerful, tanky, basic Pokemon. We've built this list, and it looks a little bit quirkier than I think we initially thought. So we'll have to wait and see whether this is any better than other sort of aggressive, ancient-style decks. We're going to be testing some early lists in a few weeks' time, so we will obviously report back when we've had some time to actually play around with the archetype, but it looks a little bit less inspiring than initially thought when we discussed it last week. Still could be a really good beat stick deck, though, just trying to Exploding Flare and take out, potentially even uptrade into some V-star Pokemon and EX Pokemon that are, or not necessarily uptrade, but like using your basic to knock out like evolution Pokemon is always really good, sort of resources wise. So yeah, it could be still a pretty powerful attacker. For Alligator, again, we talked about last week. I don't think there's anything that's been revealed that helps buff that card. Sharpedo can discard from the opponent's hand, but nothing really too interesting. Keldeo has got Rapid Draw. Frostmoth and Snom. Obviously, I You have to respect the arts. The arts look great, of course, but attack-wise, nothing too interesting, to be honest. Wiglet we talked about last week. Finizen and Palafin. Still waiting for a good Palafin card. I still don't think this one's quite good enough. 1 for 130 is obviously really powerful. You then deal 10 damage to itself for each damage counter already on you. So yeah, Vanguard Punch can potentially just be a 1 for 130, which is a pretty efficient attack, to be honest. But on a stage 1 that isn't the most searchable, could be a bit awkward. I guess we do have Irida, so it makes it a little bit better, but I still don't think there's enough to build around Palafin right now. I think we need like a Palafin EX or something that helps bring the package together. At the moment, we've got 2 pretty efficient attackers, but neither of them are particularly inspiring overall. Walking Wake and Wugtrio we've already kind of discussed. Walking Wake potentially buffed with some more poison support. Obviously, Catharsis Roar does more damage if they're affected by a special condition, so helped with that, pushing potentially up to 290 with the buffs from the Stadium plus Radiant Hisuian Sneasler. Pretty key number, getting over that 280 mark, which we've seen is quite important, but in general, not quite reaching the like 300 mark, 330 mark, which is also really important for stage 2 EXs. So could be a potential buff, but it sounds like it could be quite a clunky deck, to be honest, if you're running all of those kinds of attackers, rather than having to play something like a Palkia with it instead. Maybe you can run it all together. Sounds a little bit clunky, though. Not too sure. Again, nothing really inspiring for Wugtrio. There's nothing that's been revealed that makes me much more interested in the Troika Pump attack. We've got a Psychic type, Marill and Azumarill, obviously representing their Fairy typing. Nothing too interesting, though. Bronzong has Evolution Jammer. Interestingly, you can get this out on turn 1 if you're going second with that new supporter card and stop your opponent from ever evolving their Pokemon, but realistically, you're also only doing 30 damage per turn, so they're probably going to have some way of being able to deal with this Bronzong to then be able to evolve up, and all of a sudden, like, one Charizard runs through the deck or whatever. So, yeah, not really anything worth building around, I don't think. Reuniclus was revealed this week. You can look at the top 8 of your deck and put any number of Pokemon you find there onto your bench. Very powerful effect. You could even tutor some specific Pokemon with the Mallow style card, but realistically, not really worth playing a stage 2 to try and build around that. Fluttermane has that ability lock. Again, kind of difficult to find in early turns, but could still be an interesting option for some of the ancient decks. Still always on the hunt for options for Relicanth and being able to try and capitalize on some of these other Pokemon that will, or lower HP Pokemon, basic and stage 1 Pokemon that evolve into stage 2s. There's been some discussion this week about things like Junt Hunt, but I don't think they're, again, really powerful enough options to build around Relicanth. I still think the best option is probably going to be one of either Incineroar. Those Incineroar does look a lot weaker with the release of Maximum Belt, to be honest. Just tangent, because of Maximum Belt, meaning Charizard can play a more tempo-y game, can start doing 230 potentially from turn 2. The benefit of Incineroar was being able to have early game pressure, whereas it was outclassed in the late game, and now potentially Charizard has the early game pressure in Maximum Belt anyway, so Incineroar looks a lot worse. Overall, again, potentially one of the only benefits is this Deep in Memories combo, but I'm not sure we would ever want to build around that. Similarly, like Regigigas V-Star can copy Regigigas' attack that does 100 plus 10 more for each damage counter on the V-Star. Again, very powerful effect, but not sure whether it's worth building around the archetype just for that. Golurk and Golurk, not too interesting. Golurk does a 240 for 4 colorless, which is quite cool on 2 prize Pokemon, but in general, again, not really worth investing into. Brilliant art, though. Reminds me of a show or a film I watched called The Iron Giant, which you may or may not know. Looks really, really cool art. Like it a lot. Mudbury and Mudsdale, not really too interesting. Roly-Coly, Joe has informed me this is an upgrade to GLC. The current GLC decks that run Colossal play a Roly-Coly that can now be heavy ball searched, so keep that in mind for your GLC decks. Thank you very much, Joe. That's not one I would have picked up. Colossal has the Gatling Tar attack that does 80 more for each, 40 plus 80 more for each fire energy attached to it. Interestingly, this does do 280 with a reversal energy if you're behind on prizes, which is quite powerful. Still don't think it's worth investing into a line that doesn't really have any acceleration or added consistency to it, though. Sorry, more so consistency than acceleration. Don't think it's really worth investing in an archetype like that or a stage 2 line like that. But 280, again, really key number for 2 energy, arguably. I don't know how... I don't think reversal would work on its own, because I think you have to basically consider all of the energy at once. So your fighting can't also be a fire at the same time. But I could be wrong with that. Maybe because you're declaring Gatling Tar, at that point it's a fighting energy, and then when you do the damage calculation, it turns to a fire energy. Someone in the comments let me know. Maybe you can just do this for 1 reversal, which does make the card considerably better, actually, because you're able to then just attach a reversal energy rather than having to find the fighting energy as well. Great Tusk, one we've already discussed. Potential milling option. Still think this is probably one of the better milling options out there, but there was nothing really revealed to help boost or supplement that deck overall. Nothing too impressive with the Arbok line. Nothing to help out the Gengar line, I don't think. Still a little bit underwhelmed by this Pokemon overall, or this card overall, but we'll have to see whether anyone builds around Corroding Curse, and whether just that sort of efficient attack plus annoyance from Corroding Curse is worth trying to build a stage 2 around, which again doesn't really have too much support. Poochyena and Mightyena not too interesting. Sableye not too interesting. Roaring Moon discussed last week. Vengeful Feathers looks to be a potential 1 prize archetype. Again, an archetype that I think looks a little bit worse now that we've built it, compared to what we first initially thought when we were just discussing the cards last week. Looks a little bit weaker than initially thought, just because the list still looks a little bit wonky, even though you're able to play supporters instead of like Pokemon of the old Vespiquen decks. Still looks a little bit wonky here and there, so one that I think we need to really test out and see how consistently you can actually start trading up with Vengeful Feathers. And Koraidon, again, Koraidon and Raging Bolt, ones we discussed last week. Koraidon still a pretty cool 1 prize attacker in the ancient decks, in both, I think potentially in Roaring Moon, but more so in the Raging Bolt EX deck as a 1 prize option to go alongside Raging Bolt. Still think this could be a really powerful archetype. I'm really excited to try this one out. These style of attacks often are very hit or miss. They're sometimes very powerful. They sometimes don't really do anything at all. I think the benefits of this one is we already have a relatively consistent ancient engine in the Roaring Moon deck. Now, this obviously is trying to find a different or 2 different types of energy. But even so, like, we have some inbuilt consistency from like Bursting Roar, and we have just having an extra 10 HP compared to Roaring Moon is going to be enough to push you into 300 ranges, which is pretty key with the ancient tools. So yeah, quite excited to try out this archetype. Really, really tanky, 240 HP, no weakness. A lot going for the archetype, I think, overall. Hoot and Noctowl, not too interesting. Brilliant art on the Noctowl, though. This attack searches for 2 of any card you want, but not really powerful enough. The Dunsparce, can't remember whether this has been revealed when we discussed them last week. But yeah, quite an interesting one. Once during a turn, you may draw 3 cards. If you do, you then shuffle the Dunsparce back into your deck. Could potentially be an alternative draw engine to like a Barrel or something, getting you further over the line compared to the 5 cards Barrel gets you. Is quite a unique effect. I don't know how much you would want to invest in searching this out over and over again, but if you maybe play like a 3-3 line or something, you're potentially able to draw into your other Dunsparces and sort of start a cycle going. You can use late game Poffins that you didn't use early on to search out the regular Dunsparce to evolve on the next turn. So could be an interesting draw option. I don't think it's quite powerful enough. Works as a switching out as well, actually, which is quite cool. You can promote it as a pivot and then jump back into the deck with dashing draw. Onboard draw is always good against things like Iona and Roxanne. So yeah, I think I don't think I'm sold. I think there's still better options out there, but quite interested to see whether anyone tries to build an engine around this to see how it works out. I don't think it's quite going to be powerful enough, but really unique effect, and I like that you can even potentially bank multiple Dunsparce on the board, ready for an Iono turn to then like dash and draw a couple of times and draw 6 cards or whatever. I don't think you'd really want 3 out. That seems quite expensive. You'd really have to do it in a deck that is very self-sufficient and doesn't need too many other resources. But yeah, pretty interesting card, quite a powerful draw effect. We'll just have to wait and see whether it's better than some of our other options right now. Chatot, search for 3 basics and put them onto the bench. Because this costs an energy, it's kind of awkward. You need to play this with basically 3 retreaters only. So I can think of very few decks that would actually want to play this, but really powerful effect. I hope to see some more of these effects going forward that are a bit more accessible. This is why Hisuian Basculin is probably the best Call for Family Pokemon we have right now, because you don't need to spend an energy to use the attack, which means you can spend your energy retreating, which means you don't have to play 4 of Hisuian Basculin. You're able to just play Ball Search cards to find it and then retreat it. Whereas with Chatot, because you want to start it, because you need to attach to Acapella, you then need to play multiple of this card, and all of a sudden it looks a little bit worse. So yeah, I still think the Basculin is better than Chatot overall. Cincino has special roll, which isn't really too impactful, just does 70 for each special energy card attached to it. Not really worth discussing too much. I think we have like much better ways of doing reliable damage than having to attach a boatload of special energy onto a relatively like flimsy one prize Pokemon as well. So that's Wild Force. I think that's called. That's Wild Force. Onto Cyber Judge again. Hopefully turboing through most of this stuff. We kind of discussed the Shiftry, not particularly powerful. I did get this effect wrong. You do choose the basics or the bench Pokemon your opponent keeps, and they shuffle the other ones back in. So you can. It is a little bit more targeted than I initially thought when we did the video last week. But even so, I still don't think there's enough to be able to build around it. You're still probably going to have to like shuffle in. Well, your opponent's probably going to see things like the C-Dots and put an additional attacker out, so that you can't pick all of their attackers at once. So that, I think, is the biggest issue with the card overall. Shreemus and Breloom, not too impressive, though I do quite like this Breloom art. It's pretty cool. Deerling and Sawsbuck. Sawsbuck has an interesting ability, Seasonal Change, which lets you search for a stadium once per turn. A nice little utility card, but I don't think it's really worth building around. I think we have enough draw right now that we should be able to find our stadiums. Unless you're finding a very key stadium, I don't think this is really going to be worth it. We also have plenty of ways of bumping stadiums that aren't with stadiums, or finding ways to bump stadiums that aren't with stadiums, i.e. basically vacuum. We have plenty of ways of finding that in things like Arven and Irida as well. So I don't think this quite fits the bill right now, but pretty interesting effect, one to keep in mind potentially if you're a deck that plays a lot of different stadiums. Brambleghast has Weed Spirit, which gives it an additional 50 HP for each prize your opponent has taken. 300 HP one prizes are pretty annoying, but again, if they're getting to the point where they're 300 HP, your opponent is close to winning the game. And Powerful Needles is a pretty unreliable attack to try and get yourself over the line. 80 times the number of heads flips you flip on energy cards you have attached to you is never the most reliable effect overall, so I don't think this is really one to talk about too much. We discussed Rabscar, I think, a little bit last time, but essentially has bench barrier, but also prevents effects, so it's like a combination of Jirachi and Manaphy. Still think Jirachi and or Manaphy is going to be better just for Poffin-based search and getting out the key one at the right time, but obviously this combines both into one, so there are potentially arguments to play it. I think most of the time, though, Manaphy and Jirachi, because you can recycle them quite quickly, you can get them back into the deck and search them out again, especially now that we have Poffin as well. It makes it a little bit more appealing to, even though you have to potentially have 2 bench spaces to have this effect, your opponent isn't able to attack both angles at one point or at the same point. Whereas if they sort of Gust, KO your Rabscar, you potentially have 2 turns of having neither of these effects. Whereas at least if they're Gust KOing a Jirachi or a Manaphy, you're getting one of those effects for a little while still. And potentially, again, with Rod plus Poffin or whatever, you're able to get the effect back in play immediately, which obviously you can't always do with a Rabscar. You'd have to have another Relor down or something, and all of a sudden that sounds overly complicated. Iron Leaves EX, I think, looks a little bit worse. Now we have potentially another Grass-type deck in the format. I still think this could be probably the Grass-type Pokemon that you end up playing in Lost Box decks to deal with Charizard, though. So still a pretty relevant Pokemon, but I think there's less likely a Grass-type deck sort of built around this, and instead It's going to be built around that Torterra potentially, and this will just be a bit part player insight kind of decks that have decks that are like more toolboxy, that kind of thing. Magcargo has the lava pools, or the floor is lava as it was translated on Twitter as its ability, which causes your opponent to be burnt when they move into the active. Don't really think it's too relevant. The Victini, I don't think it's too relevant either. It does discard a special energy though, could be interesting, but not really for a fire energy, not really worth investing into. Only hits in some key scenarios. The Litten and Torracat are definitely downgrades on the ones we already have, and Incineroar, again, like I say, looks a little bit worse than it initially did because Charizard now has the option to play Maximum Belt to have that early tempo that Incineroar may have provided, being able to Blazing Bomb for a reduced amount of energy. So I think Incineroar looks considerably worse than it did now that we have the reveal of that card, which is a shame because it would have been pretty cool to see another Stage 2 archetype that sort of contested Charizard in the space of being a powerful, like, tanky EX that was just trying to take efficient KOs. I think Charizard has the early game on lock now, which is pretty sad for Incineroar. Raichu, not really worth investing too much time into, similar with Electivire. Electivire does do 160, which is quite powerful for 2 colourless. I guess 140 with a DTE, which is the perfect number for knocking out things like Pidgeot and stuff with weakness, which is quite cool. In particular, if your opponent has any water Pokemon in play. So again, I'm thinking things like Luminion in play. I'm thinking things like Manaphy in play. I'm thinking things like Palkia in play. So maybe a little bit better than initially thought of. This seems like a brilliant card for like a Zoroark deck, but because Zoroark's rotating, I feel like this potentially will never see the light of day, to be honest, which is a shame because it could be a cool attacker in that deck. Vikavolt does 120 plus 80 for each Charger Bug on your bench. Don't know whether this includes the Radiant one, don't think it does, but if it does, that's quite cool. I think you need to have 2 Charger Bugs on your bench for this to be doing relevant damage, but I still don't know how we're necessarily powering this up outside of like Electric Generator, which doesn't sound particularly powerful in a Stage 2 deck. Sounds a bit overcomplicated, to be honest. Iron Thorns, I still think, is one of the weaker future Pokemon we've seen. I don't think Destro Press, don't really know how to say that. Don't really think the attack is worth building around, unfortunately. Mr. Mime copies a supporter, don't really think it's too relevant. Girafarig, again, not overly relevant. The Farigiraf, I think is the Farigiraf EX, is the more interesting piece of these two, but this is at least a psychic type that you can potentially attach energy to with like a Gardevoir or something before you then evolve it up. Rabombe deals 30 damage and takes an extra 2 prizes if you take a knockout. Don't think it's powerful enough overall, to be honest. Don't think there's any ways to really manipulate the damage or anything like that. And it's on Stage 1, so a lot of limitations to that card. Iron Valiant, again, discussed last week. I think there's probably better options for dealing large amounts of damage in the future style deck, so don't think it's quite relevant enough. I think Miraidon and the other Iron Valiant seem like better one prize options overall. So yeah, calculation is quite interesting for helping weave together early turns, but most of the time you want to be trying to use that Miraidon for the energy acceleration regardless. So don't think this is going to quite see play, unfortunately. Iron Crown still seems very powerful. I still think the deck looks quite interesting. The future deck is one of the 3 decks that we chatted about last week, and overall I think probably looks the best, or at least the one that looks as impressive as we potentially thought it was going to. Like I say, the Roaring Moon one prize deck and the Gouging Fire Ancient deck look a little bit clunkier than we initially thought, so we need to do some hands-on testing with those, but this archetype still looks really, really sound. I think there's going to be a lot of options for this kind of future box style archetype. There's going to be decks that really lean into the energy acceleration. There's going to be decks that lean into a lot of different attackers. There'll be decks that lean into a lot of the damage manipulation. So I think there could be a few different strands of this future style deck. We'll have to wait and see which is the strongest. Meditite and Medicham, pretty boring overall. Droba has Dig About, which lets you discard 3 fighting energy from your deck. Quite a good deck thinning, as well as potentially a buff to Koraidon decks. Don't really think it's going to be too relevant though. But one to keep in mind if we ever get sort of discard synergy or energy acceleration from the discard. I don't think there's anything else I'm missing. I think Koraidon is the only one that we really have right now. Obviously gets energy into the bin, for some other potential energy acceleration options, but I think overall there's not many reasons to be building around fighting right now, so not too many reasons to be excited about Drillbur overall either. Iron Boulder still seems quite weak overall. I don't think there's going to be situations where you really want to be playing fighting energy in your future deck. I don't think it really does too much for you overall, so I think it's one of the weaker future EX Pokemon. Farigiraf, like I mentioned, still looks pretty good. Potentially a little bit weaker if the ancient decks aren't quite as powerful as we first thought. But Armatail still being an annoyance could be a key, could mean it's a key tech card here and there in specific situations. Especially if the future deck is still very valid. Maybe this is still a splashable one of EX Pokemon. Fortress, not too interesting. Scizor isn't one we've talked about on the channel. Has the Crossbreaker attack, which is obviously very, very similar to the Ice Rider VMAX that we've seen in the past. I think 120 times 2, 240 is considerably worse than the 250. Even that 10 damage difference is considerably worse because it means that you can't sort of choice belt your way to get to V-star range. You're 10 short, which is unfortunate. We do have energy acceleration in the form of Metang. Obviously, this was revealed after Metang, I think, so this could potentially be like an inbuilt archetype, Scizor plus Metang, but I don't think overall it's really worth building around too much. I think we have better metal options overall. Mawile isn't too interesting. Metang we've kind of already discussed. Best partner probably is going to be the Origin Dialga, maybe like Reveroom or something. Don't think there's anything else that's too relevant right now, unless anything pops up momentarily. Meltan and Melmetal take the cake for two cards with the least text on them, but the highest numbers on them. Look at that. 5 for 230 on a vanilla one prize stage 1 Pokemon is probably some kind of record, I think. But other than that, not really interesting overall. Iron Tread still looks quite cool. Potentially being able to hit for 2 types of weakness could be quite powerful. 2 key weaknesses in dealing with Chien-Pao and dealing with Miraidon. So yeah, still potentially a good one-of for the future decks if they do decide to go down that route. And again, Miraidon piecing it all together, Speed Peak, being able to get everything sort of set up and ready to go. I still think is going to be a very, very powerful card. Still one of the better cards we've seen as well overall. Lickitung and Licky Licky don't really do anything too interesting. They do have quite cool attack names though. Tongue Reel and Tongue Nado is quite funny. Still pretty weak overall. Good art though. Again, really, really good art in this set. Skitty and Delcatty don't really do anything too interesting. I think Pidove is one of the last cards to discuss. With the Emergency Evolution ability, once during your turn, if this Pokemon's remaining HP is 30 or less, you may search your deck for an Unfezant or Unfezant EX and put it onto this Pokemon to evolve it, then shuffle your deck. So you can, because it only has 50 HP, you can play Calamitous Sloamy Mountains or Gapejaw Bog to be able to get this to 30 HP immediately. But I don't think the Unfezant that we have right now, which has the reverse wind attack, that puts 2 energy from your opponent's active Pokemon back into their hand. Don't think that's really worth building around overall, to be honest. Though the explicit mention of an Unfezant EX makes me think there may be an Unfezant EX coming in the future that could be worth building around. So yeah, worth keeping in mind. Does really scare me though, having to put damage on the basic Pokemon when we are in a format full of TMD evolution. Obviously being able to just only need to do 30 more damage to then potentially devolve an Unfezant or an Unfezant EX and knock them out doesn't sound great. So I think the deck potentially still has some limitations. We'll have to wait and see. And then finally we have Drampa, not really too interesting, I don't think. 100 plus 120 if all of your bench Pokemon have at least 1 damage counter on them. I'd be interested to know whether this needs, whether like you need to have any benched Pokemon on them. Like whether if you have 0 benched Pokemon, technically all of them have at least 1 damage counter because you don't have any. So I'd be interested to know the interaction between there. It sounds kind of counterintuitive. If you don't have benched Pokemon, you can't do the damage, but still will be interesting to get a ruling on that. Even so, obviously very, very powerful attack, but I don't think overall worth building around, to be honest. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Still some pretty key cards that we saw today. I wasn't expecting too much at all, to be honest, but we actually got some pretty relevant cards. I actually think one of the cards I'm most excited about building around, or most excited about trying out, is that Torterra EX. I don't think it's going to sort of blow me away. I still think there's going to be some serious issues with the archetype, but it does seem quite tanky, does seem quite low to the ground, and just simple. Obviously, still in a stage 2, does present itself as an issue in some cases, but the whole line being good is the exact reason why Gardevoir is good. So whilst we're not drawing cards, we do have some consistency from Grottle, which could be good enough, and being a good type right now could be enough to potentially dethrone Charizard, or at least knock it down. If you don't think it's the head of the format, it could at least potentially knock it down a few pegs, down to maybe those mid tiers. So yeah, let me know what you thought. Were there any cards that I missed? Were there any cards that I completely glossed over that you think are the best thing since sliced bread? Let me know down in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear what you think. We're going to be starting to build some decks very soon and record some gameplay once we've got the next 2 regionals out of the way, and we are sort of then heading into EUIC, ready for rotation and stuff. We're going to have plenty of Temporal Forces content on the way. So yeah, make sure you stay tuned, and we will close things out with this. I think some of the special art's going to be brilliant in this set. So yeah, make sure you pick up some of these cards as well when they come out. It's going to be really exciting. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from OmniPoke, and I look forward to seeing you guys in another video tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.